Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming along. And what I'm going to be talking about for the next 40 to 45 minutes is the Second World War, the state and the British Conservative Party between 1939 and 1951. And this is for the Arts and Humanities Society, which is our new name for the LRAC. And I want to start by, first of all, describing a myth about Conservative Party policy in the 20th century. And it's one with which you're probably familiar. So at least until the 1990s, there was a kind of standard narrative about the Tory party's approach to the state, and it went something like this. The party apparently adopted a limited state, laissez-faire approach to social and economic issues in the interwar years. And that position, which was embodied in the national government, which certainly in its iteration, its latter iteration, was dominated by the Conservative Party, led to the party being seen as gratuitously neglectful in respect of unemployment and manufacturing decline in the Depression years. But then the Second World War and Labour's landslide win in 1945 caused a major revision in Tory policy, with the party embracing full employment, welfare state, and indeed some of the apparatus of collectivism that had been created by Attlee's government. And so the Tories were able thereby to discard their nasty, in inverted commas, interwar image and embrace the consensus created by the war and by the Labour Party. And this new state-friendly conservatism was to last until the mid-1970s, when it was destroyed by the arrival of Margaret Thatcher and her neoliberal supporters. Now, that's the narrative, and it's a fairly straightforward narrative, and it does have the advantage of being coherent and easy to understand. And likewise, it contains some truth, but nonetheless, it is too simplistic. And one of the problems here is that until maybe about 20 years ago, the Tory party had pretty much been allowed to write its own history. If you go and look at the, even on Amazon, this is obvious, but although you can see it even more clearly if you go to something like Google Scholar, and look at the amount of material that's been written by historians in particular about the Labour Party and compare that to the amount of material that's been written about the Conservative Party, the former vastly outweighs the latter, even now, although the balance has become a little more even. And so the people who were writing about Tory party history tended to be those people who had a kind of vested interest, or were members of the Tory party, or indeed often were involved in government themselves. The narrative pattern that I explained at the beginning can be partly explained by a sort of competition within the party between economic liberals on the one hand and more state-centric Tories on the other. And they wanted to talk about their party's history in a way that fitted with their own doctrinal preferences. So, for instance, in the 1990s, there were histories published by Ian Gilmore, largely seen as quite far to the left of the Conservative Party, and Alan Clark, who was on the economic liberal and then, in inverted commas, right of the Tory Party. They both published books in the 1990s, and those both subscribed to that classic narrative that I just outlined. And that narrative allows each tendency within the party to characterize the periods in which the opposing ideological strand of conservatism, when that's in the ascendant, they can characterize those periods as ones of relative failure or mismanagement. To simplify, for Gilmore, this meant the 1950s good, the 1980s bad, and exactly the reverse in the case of Alan Clark. So it was another more neutral historian of the party, John Charmley, has remarked, these explanations are really instruments in an ongoing contemporary struggle for the soul of the Tory party. And likewise, that conventional narrative, that description has been reinforced by the British left's extensive use of it as a kind of propaganda weapon. And that has been shown in particularly in the potent image of the hungry 1930s. I'll give you an example there. There we go. These are posters from the 1945 and 1950 general election, contrasting what Labour has done with that image of the hungry 1930s, and by implication that neglect and that supposedly uncaring attitude on the part of the Tory-dominated national government in the later 1930s. But of course, history written by interested parties is never entirely satisfactory. So it's up to us as historians to hold up such accounts to scrutiny and instead to convey some of the ambiguities and complexities that aren't captured by those overly clean explanations. First off, the Tories were not nearly so obsessed with free markets and the minimal state in the 1930s as has sometimes been assumed. In fact, historians have increasingly acknowledged that the national government used extensive state intervention to try and alleviate the depression. Whether it was successful is a different matter. Not only did it endeavour to keep money cheap, but it also created a large number of public corporations and marketing boards to stimulate industrial efficiency. And some historians, such as Alan Booth, have even gone so far as to say that the government's encouragement of market concentration and restrictive practices, that is, things like mergers, cartels, imperial tariffs, resale price maintenance, monopoly, and the such like, was a deliberate attempt to create a managed economy which would be better able to compete internationally, whilst most importantly, protecting jobs at home as well. That the British economy responded very slowly to these measures was arguably more to do with its long-term structural defects than to so-called Tory neglect. So we should be differentiating between the Tory party rhetoric about the dangers of an intrusive state and how the party actually behaved when it was in office. The rhetoric is motivated principally by anti-socialism, and you can see some of that there. This is admittedly before the 1930s. It's a 1929 poster, but nonetheless, this is a fairly consistent language and symbolism that is used throughout the interwar years. For conservatives, socialism was a threat because of its supposed internationalist leanings, internationalist being a kind of a catch-all code word for various types of communism. The conservatives aren't really that keen then or now to differentiate particularly between different types of communism. Also a confiscatory fiscal policy, and above all, the practicalities of power. In other words, because Labour had replaced the Liberal Party as the main electoral threat to Tory parliamentary dominance. After World War I, with a supposedly volatile and poorly educated mass electorate in place, it was politically necessary for the Tories to portray the Labour Party as essentially unpatriotic, as you can see there, and as endangering civil liberties. Here's another example, the supposed threat to English values posed by socialism. Secondly, although World War II is sometimes credited with bringing in huge political changes, my argument is that its impact on conservative policy was probably mostly indirect. Certainly, most conservatives had accepted the main wartime initiatives that ultimately made up the post-war social consensus, so-called, such as the Butler Education Act, the Beveridge Report, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and the 1944 White Paper on Employment Policy. Generally, within the party, these were recognised as a kind of bounty, duly won by the working classes by their wartime efforts. But even here, we must add a caveat that demonstrates the party's ambiguous attitude towards the state. In the case of the Beveridge Report, for instance, Conservative MPs were initially deeply split over it. Churchill, in fact, only consented to its publication on the basis that although the report could be accepted in principle, no legislation could be put through whilst the war was being fought. That was a deliberate compromise to keep an argument a lid on an argument within the Tory party itself. So on the one hand, for example, you have the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kingsley Wood, arguing that the implementation of the Beveridge scheme would involve intolerable rises in taxation and extension of state powers. And on the other, when you have the report debated in the Commons in February 1943, 45 MPs from the newly formed Tory Reform Committee, that's two of their leading lights. They're looking very, very modern there. So there's 45 MPs in that group on the backbenches, and they were calling for the immediate creation of a Ministry for Social Security to begin work on the legislation that Beveridge's proposals would require. In fact, in the end, the only initiative from the report that becomes law prior to the war's end is the Family Allowances Act of early 1945. But the fact that there are divisions in Tory ranks suggests that there would be further conflict over the state's role in the future. And the same, in fact, can be said about the White Paper on Employment that came out in May 1944. And that document took on an almost mythical status in the post-war world because it supposedly created a cross-party agreement that government responsibilities included the maintenance of full employment. Now, if that had really been the case, if that myth had more truth in it than in fact it does, then we would expect those Tories in the laissez-faire faction of the party to attack the 1944 White Paper, but they didn't. And the reason for that was that it pledged nothing that Conservatives on the whole couldn't live with. The document promised only that government would try to sustain a high and stable level of employment rather than full employment. And it would intervene in the economy mainly to stop it dipping into recession. In other words, it was a counter-cyclical demand management that it promised. By all means, ask me questions about that at the end if you're unfamiliar with that term. And the paper did not envisage any clear micro planning machinery or any physical controls in order to fulfill that goal. In fact, I suppose you might call them parsimonious economists at the Treasury, people like Lionel Robbins, had inserted loads of caveats into the White Paper to show that this high and stable employment goal was dependent on a lot of different factors and not simply a government's desire to intervene. Moreover, the paper required the institutions of industry, labour and finance, things like the TUC, and the FBI. I'd say the FBI is the Federation of British Industries, by the way, not to be confused with its more famous counterpart across the pond. It's what's now called the CBI. But that's one of the major institutions of industry, and with the TUC and with other institutions of finance as well, like Bank of England, for example. The idea was that they should all be acting to, as far as possible, create conditions of full employment and at the same time not overinflating the economy. Now, arguably, their moderation that is argued for, that is urged in that white paper, is not truly exercised over the next 30 years, but that's kind of a different story. So, in fact, what that white paper says, despite the myths around it, it's hardly surprising that most Tories, whether they're on the right or the left of the party, if those labels actually mean anything, they didn't really bat an eyelid at the proposals in the document. So it's only later, when the Labour Party kind of skillfully repackages the 44 white paper and works on its sentiments, or promulgates its sentiments in a different way, that you get a shift. This is post-war, from a commitment to what was a relatively modest aim to a vow to uphold full employment. So the war's effect then is not that it pushes the Tory party towards some form of collectivism, but instead it's primarily because of its impact on the Labour Party that the conflict helps to shape Conservative policy. But what the Second World War does is to replace essentially a kind of esoteric argument about the efficiency and the justice of socialism, or at least state control, with a concrete example. And the wartime extension of state powers demonstrated that economically, central control need not always be the disaster that the laissez-faire liberals had foretold. And that demonstration, that example, is coupled with a determined attempt on the part of social commentators like J.B. Priestley, and indeed some people within the government itself, to promote post-war social reform, by which I mean things like employment, better homes, healthier food, wider education, that sort of thing. And that leads to the more extreme strains of economic libertarianism, which are kind of floating around on the right of the Conservative Party, being effectively completely marginalised from political debate throughout at least the second part, the second half of the wartime period. So this cartoon by David Lowe, for example, shows how far such views have become ridiculous, even by 1942. You can see there various sort of ragbag of extreme individualists carrying banners such as "Lay down your lives for the profit motive," "Fight for the liberty to be exploited," and so forth. And the soldier is questioning whether they've got the right war. Of course, Lowe was a socialist himself, so naturally he's exaggerated those things for comic effect, but you get the impression there. So in short, the Second World War makes socialism marketable and the Labour Party electable. And that poses a grave problem for the Tories because, as I've said, their interwar election campaigns have played heavily on the threat posed to British life by socialism. You may be aware already of Churchill's famous first election broadcast in the campaign, and it's later widely judged to be a mistake. There it is, or at least this is the salient part of it. I'm not going to do the voice. largely because it kind of hurts my throat, really. I must tell you that a socialist policy is abhorrent to British ideas on freedom. There is to be one state to which all are to be obedient in every act of their lives. This state, once in power, will prescribe for everyone where they are to work, what they are to work at, where they may go and what they may say, what views they are to hold, where their wives are to queue up for the state ration. That seems a bit odd. But, I suppose yeah, a reflection of the time, and what education their children are to receive. A socialist state could not afford to suffer opposition. No socialist system can be established without a political police. They, by which he meant the Labour Party, of course, would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, although no doubt humanely directed in the first instance. Kind of a soft piece of a little bromide at the end there. Now, Churchill had probably been influenced in the preparation of this speech by Friedrich von Hayek's recent book, The Road to Serfdom, which was a kind of a howl in the wilderness at the time, but it saw state intervention as both economically efficient and corrosive of civil liberty. But in essence, that's of less weight and less note than what had happened. The dominant tropes, if you like, of the interwar years. Churchill's broadcast is really a relatively unsophisticated throwback to that rhetoric, to the rhetoric used against the Labour Party in the interwar years, which we saw examples of with those posters from the interwar elections. In this case, however, it seems it may have been a blunder. Indeed, Churchill's daughter suggested to him that he had completely misjudged the tenor of the Times, and this is her letter to him after the Gestapo speech. Socialism as practiced during the war did no one any harm and quite a lot of people good. The children of this country have never been quite so well fed and healthy. The rich did not die because their meat ration was no larger than the poor, and there is no doubt that this common sharing and feeling of sacrifice was one of the strongest bonds that unified us. So why, they say, cannot this common feeling of sacrifice be made to work as effectively in peace? Okay. Now, of course, picking apart that, this does assume that what was practiced during the war was socialism, but nonetheless, this kind of criticism, all the more effective from coming from the Prime Minister's daughter, is nonetheless important. The Gestapo speech, as it came to be known, is very easy to ridicule. There's another cartoon here by David Lowe, as Churchill's having his wrist slapped there. Life under the Attlee Terror, victim tortured for making a naughty speech. And certainly the speech goes down in Tory party legend as a major reason for the size of the Conservative defeat. However, evidence is actually quite mixed about the speech's impact. The left of the Tory party was mostly horrified at its harshness, but that may not necessarily have been the reaction of the public. So if we look at opinion poll evidence, we can see, let's have a look there. Now, this is from BIPO, that's the British Institute of Public Opinion. It's a relatively new polling organisation, which is set up in the early 40s, and models what the Gallup organisation had been in the States. So, but public opinion and polling is very much in its infancy at this particular point in time. I mean, you might say that it's no better now, really, at predicting things, but this is kind of the best we've got for a kind of collective view of certain types of public opinion testing. Now you can see there that the Labour leads the Tories for pretty much all of the war's later years, from the middle of 43 to the general election of 45. And by early 1945, that February 45 figure there is pretty high. But regardless, in early 45, the three polls that date from that period, February, April, and May, that's a lead that is 15% plus throughout that early period of 45. But the fly in the ointment here is, and you can see where I put that arrow in, that immediately after Churchill's speech, the Labour Party's lead over the Conservatives drops back to something around 8 or 9%. So there's difficulty in explaining this. If this speech has been so has caused such consternation, but did it in fact make a constructive contribution to the Conservative standing at this point? Or is there a problem with sources? Is it simply that public opinion polling is so rudimentary that this kind of snapshot is not at all helpful? Or there's a third possibility, which is the one I tend to lean towards, and that is that until early June, Churchill had really not played very much part in the election campaign, and his speech is his first major foray, if you like, into the campaign. And so is it simply that his entry into the fray, rather than what he said, that causes the upsurge in support for the Tories? Obviously not enough to overturn the Labour Party's lead there, but nonetheless, it's one of those kind of murky moments about which it's impossible to be sure. But this is why that's why I'm in the business of history. I'm sure it's one of the reasons why you're all interested in history, is because there are these kind of intangible little mysteries that are kind of locked away within the past. What we can say about this is that the Gestapo speech indicated that old tactics, harking back to an idea of the Labour Party as essentially trying to impose something that was not far short of communism, were not sufficient for the Tories to overtake a conspicuously moderate and modernising Labour Party. And it also confirmed what had become apparent in parliamentary and party politics during the war, and that is that the Conservatives were still confused about what the ideal role of the state should be, regardless of how they thought the Labour Party were conceptualising it. So Labour's unexpected new electability surprised the Conservatives, but the party's other major problem, and certainly at the 45 election, was the lack of substantial policy on its own grounds. Far more than the Labour Party, the Conservatives had suspended internal party domestic policy making during the war. So their kind of unceremonious arrival in opposition at least gave them the opportunity to find some policies. And one of the first of those to kind of break public consciousness to some extent was the Industrial Charter of 1947, which was seen by many commentators, and indeed some within the party, as a major shift to the left. Here's how cartoonist Leslie Illingworth in the Daily Express saw it. This is a deliberate, for those of you who know a little bit about 19th century British political history, you'll see that this is a deliberate harking back to the 1867 Reform Act, when the Tories were accused of stealing the Whigs' clothes whilst they are bathing. Here you've got, that's Rab Butler and Anthony Eden, who are robbing the two of the leading lights in the Liberal Party, Clement Davis, its leader, and Violet Bonham Carter, of their principles, and they're going to be carried off into the open bag being held by Churchill behind the rock there, which is labelled New Tory Manifesto. There's certainly a kind of a Liberal Party feel about the Industrial Charter, because it has promises of a workers' charter. It suggests that government and industry need to work together to create a national budget, and it accepts that a lot of industries, such as the railways, can't be put into private hands, and they should remain nationalised. However, to see it as a shift towards a more interventionist stance is to some extent a mistake. First, in spirit, the Charter is not very much different to what the national government was doing in the 1930s, albeit perhaps relatively ineffectively. And second, the Charter's authors also had to, because this is an official party document, it's a kind of a policy paper that the party is wedded to some extent. The Charter's authors also had to appease the laissez-faire wing of the Conservatives. So the principle of ultimately reducing state expenditure in order to fund tax cuts was also in the document, and a pledge to free industry from one of these kind of vague catch-all phrases, unnecessary controls and restrictions. They're all going to go, those unnecessary controls and restrictions. What, of course, is deemed to be necessary and unnecessary is kind of left conveniently open. But it doesn't suggest that the Conservatives were now completely relaxed about more state control. Rather, it reflects that ongoing tension, that ongoing argument within the party that I've already referred to, about where to draw the line between the free market and the state. The trouble with these initiatives that tried to bridge philosophical gaps within the apparatus of the Tory party is, well, at the time, that the electorate was simply not listening to the Tories. For example, in September 1947, the party commissioned the Mass Observation Organisation to run a survey on public reactions to the Industrial Charter. And these results were pretty miserably disappointing, as you can see there. Hopefully, it's a little small, the text. Despite considerable press coverage, only 20% of respondents knew what it was, and only 1/4 of those, that 5% there in the yellow segment of the pie, could provide any detail on its content. And even when shown the document blind, so to speak, the Workers' Charter section of the document, most respondents thought that it was left-wing in origin, and indeed a majority of middle-class voters believe that it was communist inspired. So Mass Observation said in its final report, it is difficult not to come to the conclusion that to most people, a conservative industrial policy is not yet in any way a living idea. So the problem there is policies are kind of falling flat for the Tories in the first 2 or 3 years after the end of the Second World War. But if the to apologise again, if the Charter made no significant dent in public consciousness, what then did start to pull voters back towards the opposition? And that recovery is mainly stimulated by the government itself, the shortcomings of the government, and the Tory response to those shortcomings. So as Labour's austerity measures bit harder on the general public, the Tories began to develop a new propaganda message to counter the rhetoric of Labour about the hard 1930s and the uncaring Tories in the 1930s. So one part of that new propaganda attack is the menace of economic controls, and that had been highlighted to some extent in the Industrial Charter. Another was the accusation of economic mismanagement that became somewhat more persuasive after the failure of the East African groundnut scheme. Again, you can ask me a bit about that later if you like. But it's the third Tory line of attack that is perhaps the most important, and that is the extension of rationing in peacetime, and in particular the trimming of meat rations, which occurs in the period between the 50 and the 51 general elections. I'll give you some examples there. There's substantial public discontent about the cost of living, about shortages, and about rationing, and that's exploited ruthlessly in Conservative campaigns. That's a variety of different figures from different polls. The difficulty of comparing across time here is because these are from Gallup, and the difficulty here is that it doesn't ask the same question again and again and again. It asks different questions every time. Obviously, there's a certain amount of tweaking in opinion polls to get more accurate data out of the respondents. But all of these polls give you an example that it is rationing and the cost of living, separately or together, that are kind of combining to create a considerable problem for the Labour Party. And this is that distress amongst certain parts of the populace, and particularly apparently women, plays into a revised Tory party strategy for attacking their opponents. And that characterization of the Labour Party as partly profligate, but mostly continuing these measures of austerity needlessly, remains very powerful indeed throughout the 1950s, and particularly as there's more stress placed on the consumer, in inverted commas, which is a phenomenon that starts to snowball during the 1950s into the 1960s. So the Tories then begin to develop a novel political discourse wherein the housewife, the consumer, and the marketplace, in a broad sense, are combined into a coherent political strategy, at least in terms of campaign and literature and propaganda and that sort of thing. So where does the Conservative Party stand by 1951? 1951 obviously is the point at which they returned to power, albeit with a very, very slender majority. Now, the answer to that is, as I've tried to show through what's essentially been a series of snapshots, is not particularly straightforward. One thing that historians need to do is to step outside their immediate, more recent frame of historical reference, and that's for everything that we write about, really, and that we research. In this case, we need to acknowledge that the party's rhetorical consistency about the quote unquote rolling back of the state, if you like, is really a consequence of the Thatcher years. And in the 1940s and 50s, that type of language had yet to be adopted, and the majority of Conservatives, at least in Parliament, approached the issue far more pragmatically. But some things are clear. The first is that the standard narrative of the party being converted by the war to accept a benevolent intervening state is too simple. In fact, since the advent of mass politics and mass parties, and I'm really thinking of that as back in the last sort of third of the 19th century, the party has always been in two minds about what the function of the state should be, and that continued right up until the Second World War and way beyond as well. So the war doesn't change that, but what it does is to create an electable alternative to the Conservative Party. And that in turn means the Conservatives had to create policies which would be seen as attractive by the electorate, which built on the welfare state principles that came out of the war, but at the same time did not completely alienate their more laissez-faire supporters. And that's why you get that kind of facing both ways in policy post 1945, and indeed facing both ways really in the 1930s as well, which is where we began. The other impact that the war had was to weaken that idea, weaken the propaganda value of that idea that the Labour Party is in favour of some kind of socialist authoritarianism at the time. That requires a change of tactics, and what the Tories do is to develop symbolism of their own to counter the Labour Party's very potent symbolism about the uncaring national government during the Depression. And the main thrust of that is that whilst the Labour government could not be painted anymore as sinister and intrusive, it could be shown as economically incompetent, for example, presiding over more rationing than had existed in wartime and denying people the small luxuries that they should have been able to expect after the war. You can see some of that in the posters that I have put up on the screen there from the 51 election and the 55 election, just to show that this continues past 1951. So in short, where the Conservatives changed, it's primarily because of the impact of the Labour government, not the war per se. But in fact, the biggest change that it made were to alter its language and its image. And although this is probably the subject for another lecture, it is those alterations that substantially explain its return to power and its retention of power after 1951. Okay.